There's just so much.
You're listening to a Mamma Mia podcast.
Mamma Mia acknowledges the traditional owners of the land we have recorded this podcast on, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. We pay our respects to their elders, past and present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures.
It's a scorching hot January day in Queensland in 1925. And 19-year-old Iris Webber has just got married to her new husband, Edward. He's 20 years her senior, and the newlyweds are about to enter the Great Depression, the worst economic downturn in the history of the industrialised world. By 1932, their marriage has reached breaking point. And on an afternoon in May, Iris is lifting up a pea rifle, a weapon usually reserved for rabbits, and aiming it from 30 yards away at her husband of 7 years. She fires, and a bullet enters his right buttocks, lodging near his spine. She's locked away and charged with attempted murder, which is later downgraded to wounding with attempt to do grievous bodily harm. But this is only the start of Iris's run-ins with the law. Her next relationship will be with a woman, at a time when lesbianism and homosexuality is both illegal and admonished by society. After moving to Sydney, her criminal rap sheet will grow and grow and grow. Murder charges, assault police, illegal busking, indecent language, the accusations are endless. She's known in our history books as the most violent woman in Sydney. But there's more to the story of Iris Webber, a queer girl living during a period of Australia's history that looked at not just homosexuality, but women through a different lens. I'm Gemma Bath, and this is True Crime Conversations, a Mamma Mia podcast exploring the world's most notorious crimes by speaking to the people who know the most about them. Today's episode is about Iris Webber, a female criminal and gunslinger who roamed the streets of Sydney in the 1930s, alongside the likes of Kate Leigh and Tilly Devine. Helping us to tell her story is author Fiona Kelly McGregor. Fiona's been researching and writing about Iris for over 10 years. Her latest book, which you'll find linked in our show notes, is a dramatic retelling of Iris's life and crimes. So Fiona, Iris Webber's experience with the Australian criminal system actually started in utero. Her mum was in prison when she was pregnant. Tell me about that.
Well, her mother was working as a maid in Cooma and she was arrested for larceny. I think she stole a ring and £5, or allegedly, from her employer. And she was sentenced to 9 months in prison, but it turned out that she was pregnant with Iris. And so she got out a little bit early and she went and had Iris in the Salvation Army Women's Home in Bathurst.
And this is 1906. Where did she end up growing up? What was her childhood like?
So then she went up to Glen Innes with her mother, and her mother already had a child by a man called William Shingles, and then she had another child. And then he kind of disappears and another partner comes along called Thomas Richardson, and they had another child in Queensland. And then they came back to Glen Innes just below the border, and that's where Iris grew up. They're in the census there for the next few decades.
And was her childhood poor, rich? What kind of life did they have?
Look, I can't tell you for sure, except that looking at the addresses where they lived, according to the census records, I'd say that they were very poor, and just looking at the background of them. And Iris went into service when she was about 14 as a domestic, as was common in those days.
So she got married for the first time when she was 19. How did that go?
Not very well. It was the Depression. It was 1925 when they married, and you can imagine how poor they were. If they were already poor, that things got even worse for them. Her husband was a fettler, which is a railway worker. It's the guys who actually do work on the actual tracks. And he worked around different parts of the state. And then things went bad between them. He was borrowing a lot of money from her and her mother, and she followed him for work to Niagara Siding, which in those days was literally just a little railway siding and is now kind of the outskirts of Byron Bay. But it wasn't at all glamorous in those days. And then she was in a bush camp with him and his mates, and that would have been pretty rugged. And according to the court deposition, he was cruel to her with those friends. One night they threw her off a cart in the middle of the bush. Meanwhile, she didn't have any maintenance from him. Maintenance is what a husband paid his wife to support her.
What a lovely term.
I know. Well, I mean, she would have either been able to get very little work or not enough work to support herself. So that's what a husband had to do. And in those days, if a husband left his wife, that was one of the charges that the police brought against him, not paying maintenance. So Edwin went off and worked in Hay, owing Iris and her mother a lot of money and having treated her badly, and she went after him. And she shot him with a pea gun in Carrathul next to Hay in the buttocks.
It's such a headline.
But we probably should point out what a pea rifle is.
Yes, please do.
So a pea rifle is a small weapon that was used in Australia very commonly to shoot rabbits. There was a rabbit plague, and kids, as young as 9 or 10 were routinely taught how to use them. But she had sawn it off so that it fitted into her port, which is her bag, and also because there was a law around the licensing of firearms, which decreed that if it was sawn to a certain length, she wouldn't need a license. So she was very clever in what she did.
So even though it wasn't, in quote marks, a proper gun, it would have done some damage.
Yeah, it would have done some damage, but he never got the bullets removed.
He just left them in there?
He left them in there, yeah.
And what happened to her? Was she punished?
She certainly was, very badly. No, she was charged with attempted murder, and she did about 3 to 4 months in Hay Jail, which is a pretty miserable place. I visited it a couple of times. And she did that in the coldest months of the year. Actually, when it was a La Nina cycle like now, so it would have been freezing cold. And she was there until, I think, November, and then she was acquitted.
You gave a little bit of context before, but I'd love to delve into that a bit more. We're talking about the late 20s, early 30s, the Great Depression. What was that time in Australia like that we know of? Because it was pre-war as well. We kind of went into that in her lifetime as well.
So it was really desperate in Australia. And, I mean, there are people who say, there are historians who say it was much worse here than in the United States and indeed in the United Kingdom, because part of the reason Australia was so hammered was that we had big loans out to England, and they insisted on them being paid all throughout this period, and it was really bringing the government to its knees. So in 1932, in May, when this crime happened, the worst years of the Depression was kind of like the middle of it or coming out of it. But people at this time, men at this time, were moving all around the country to try and find work. And in the inner city of Sydney in particular, it was 30% unemployment. And I mean, women couldn't have gotten much work at the best of times anyway at that time. They couldn't open a bank account in their own name. There were very few women in university. She was from a poor background anyway.
Because this was a time, and correct me if I'm wrong, where once you got married, you couldn't work as a woman. Is that right?
Well, you ostensibly could. So, for instance, if you were doing a job like nursing or teaching, often what would happen is they would sack you if you got married, because they would say, well, you're going to have children, so you're unreliable.
So after being acquitted, Iris moves to Sydney. What were her plans there?
Well, this is where I feel a gap in the record, because the next time she appears in the record is on the census in 1933 in Glebe in June in 14 Phillip Street. And she puts next to her name domestic duties. And that's a common thing that a woman would have written then. And it's particularly common for a legitimate housewife as for a criminal. Male criminals commonly call themselves labourers and women domestics. Anyway, that's where she turns up, and I have no idea who she lived there with or what she did. And then a year later in 1934, she appears on the police records and she's living in Surrey Hills.
So when she arrives in Sydney, she's already got a criminal record, and she starts racking up some more charges. And a lot of those are for something called gathering arms.
That's right, yeah.
What is that?
Well, good question. What she was actually doing was busking with an accordion to make a quid. And busking was illegal, probably the same as now actually. You needed a licence. But it was also one of those things that was probably tolerated because, again, we're in the Depression and, you know, maybe somebody was a really good street musician or street dancer and they might be tolerated or not. But Iris was picked up for gathering arms from about 1934 through till 1940 increasingly. And I think that it was really an indication as to how much the police wanted to get her rather than, you know, how serious the crime of playing the accordion was. If you know
because
what I
it
mean.
would have been pretty common for people to be busking, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, there were lots. That's what I mean. And there were periods when, I mean, according to the newspaper reports, the police were cracking down on buskers and other times they weren't.
As far as you could tell, was that her only income during that time?
No, she was a shoplifter.
Okay.
Actually, the shoplifting charges appear later. And there were all sorts of scams. When you look at the police gazettes, there's about 4 pages of scams, and the mere titles of these scams are brilliant. And one of them is called Ringing the Changes. And it's this sort of sleight of hand that somebody does when they go into the shop with a big note and then they say, no, you've already given me my change or you haven't given me enough change, and they confuse the shopkeeper so they get extra change back.
I know she had the attempted murder charge on her rap sheet, but these scams, these were just petty criminal charges.
Yeah.
By 1935, she is living in Surrey Hills. What kind of environment and what kind of people was she rubbing shoulders with?
There's a famous quote that you might have come across with methylated spirits drinkers and the like. Well, Clisdale Street is at the bottom of Surrey Hills at the southern end, and there were 2 sections of Surrey Hills that were meant to be the worst slums in Australia. And one of them was called Frog Hollow, and it's at the northern end where we now see the police station. And that area was once a warren of tiny streets, and Chinatown, what we know as Chinatown, came further up the hill. And there were lots and lots of tiny little brothels, there were opium dens, and that place was raised gradually from the early 1900s until the time that Iris came. And the plan was to redevelop it, but they ran out of money because of the Depression. So the other section of Surrey Hills, which was meant to be the next worst, is where Iris was in Clisdale Street, which is a street that runs between the Belvoir Theatre and Devonshire Street. And now it's split-level street. And so if you walk down it, you'll see a wall which has got a bit of graffiti on it. And I think there's a Japanese restaurant on the corner. And that wall is where Iris's house was. And that's where she lived for about 6 years.
So during this time, how was Iris's love life going?
Well, she met Maisie Matthews. Now, again, I've pieced this together from later accounts. Next door to her at number 4 Clisdale Street lived Kathleen McLennan, who was a bit of a shady character. And Kathleen McLennan's best friend was Maisie Matthews, who was about 10 years younger than both of them. So by this time, Iris was 27, Kathleen was about 28, and Maisie was 18. And they fell in love. And that, of course, was a complete no-no in those days.
Yeah, so tell us about how homosexuality was received at this time in our history.
Famously, of course, it was criminalised in this state until 1984, but the law was really only applied to men. But the fact that it wasn't applied to women didn't mean that women were not persecuted. If they were known to be queer or considered non-heteronormative in any way, they were persecuted and targeted by the authorities. And going back to that charge of gathering arms, it's really clear, looking at Iris's charge sheet, that the reason that she's getting arrested more and more and getting fines and jail sentences that are way out of proportion are because her sexuality gradually comes to be known to the police. And the other thing about women, their sexuality not being criminalised, is that it's a kind of, what's the word? It's like an insult anyway, because it's with the assumption overall that women were not sexual protagonists, you know, that we were passive no matter what our orientation was. We weren't protagonists, we weren't agents, and so how could we possibly have a sexuality that was worth legislating against?
Were Iris and Maisie trying to keep their relationship private and away from the eyes?
Look, I can't, in the context of the public record and historically what I know, I can't say anything definitely, but I can certainly imagine very well because I did so much research. And there are some really, really good lesbian historians who've uncovered a lot about what women could do and couldn't do in those days. And so, yeah, I mean, I would imagine that, yes, definitely, because both of them were in and out of trouble with the law. Maisie was commonly charged and arrested and did quite a lot of prison time for soliciting. She was a very well-known sex worker. If they were known to have an aberrant sexuality as well, anything that they did, any other minor infraction, they were going to come down on them a lot harder.
One of the people that they were associating with during this time was a razor gangster, as he was known, Bill Smillie, who lived nearby. What happened to him?
Well, Bill Smillie in 1928 was working for Kate Leigh, and he committed a double slashing in Darlinghurst, reputedly over a cocaine deal gone wrong. And he went to jail for 5 years. And so just at the time when Iris probably arrived in Clisdale Street, he got out of jail, probably within the same few months. And his family home where he was born and lived most of his life was in Devonshire Street, probably, 3 minutes walk from her house. And he became romantically involved with Maisie Matthews as well.
So we've got a bit of a love triangle.
Yeah, a bit of conflict coming up.
So what was that conflict? Because there was some violence that ensued.
Well, on the public record, now Bill Smillie was shot and slashed a few times because in his line of work, that's just what happened.
Yep.
He was shot in 1935 earlier in the year by some male assailants that were unknown, and then he was shot in October 1935. The person who got arrested for that was Kathleen McLennan, who I mentioned before, who lived at number 4 Clisdale Street, and there was a court case. And she was acquitted. And a lot later, like in the 1940s, the police started to say in their records that it was probably Iris who did it.
Do you think it was Iris from your research?
I think it probably was, yeah.
In 1937, she's charged with the murder of a man named Alfred James Maley. Who was he? What happened? She's getting a bit of a reputation here.
Well, he was another gangster. He wasn't such a big deal as Bill Smillie, but mind you, when Bill Smillie came out of jail in the 1930s, he was sort of past his prime. Maley his crimes were mostly small things like betting. He got mixed up in those circles, but in a much more peripheral way than Bill Smillie. And in 1937, Maisie did a long jail sentence for a slashing as well, and he did 2 different ones. And just after they both got out of jail, they moved in together.
And so why was Iris charged with murder?
So what happened was that Maisie and Maley were living together up in Crown Street, and that house is still standing. They had this tiny room right at the top of a huge 3-story terrace house. They were fighting a particularly bad fight, and so Kathleen and Iris went up to the house to save Maisie and bring her down to Clisdale Street and hide from Alfred Maley. His nickname was Slim. We'll call him Slim Maley. And Slim came down the next morning drunk, screaming, smashing the door, and they wouldn't let him in. And then he returned at midday, even more violent and screaming more than ever. And so when Iris opened the door, reputedly, but according to a few different versions, he went for her, possibly with a razor, and she shot him with a pea rifle. And a day later, he died.
And was she found guilty of that, or what was the court process there?
No, she was acquitted of that. Yeah, but she
acquitted
was,
again?
Yeah, she was in jail for about 2 months. A shorter time then, actually, 6 weeks, yeah.
So she was gaining this real violent reputation in the eyes of the police and the media, but she was also surrounded by so many other violent people and
That's
arguably more violent people.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And it's important to look at it in the context, and it's a different language and it's a different milieu, and it's not really our place to kind of put a moral judgment on it, I don't think. Yeah.
Well, you argue in some of your work that a lot of the people around her were arguably a lot more violent than her, and that her pursuits of violence were often in the vein of justice seeking. Can you expand on why you think that?
Well, they seem to be retaliatory. I mean, everything is a bit contingent with this because, what we have are the public records, and then what I can do and what any historian would do when researching is to sift through and cross-reference. And when I look at her charge sheet, I don't see as many assault charges as I do for other people, whether they're men or women. Usually, obviously, the men have got more charges for assault. But I can't assume that that's everything. So I think I just had to make some decisions, some creative decisions, and use my gut instinct after a while. And what was a really important precursor to those decisions was actually to get rid of that judgment and just try to describe it and to feel it and understand it, actually.
Iris eventually parts way with Maisie, but she's arrested over the next year, half a dozen times. What kinds of offences were they? Are we going back to the arms, the assault police, that kind of stuff?
Yeah, petty offences, petty. And that's why I think that what had happened was that the police knew about her relationship with Maisie and they knew about her sexual orientation. And she was a really defiant person and a really lippy person in court. She was famous for speaking up and very self-righteous and very sort of justice-driven. And I think that she probably gave them a lot of lip and they really wanted to get her, so they were going to get her for any petty charge that they could.
You've been piecing together her background and her history through public records. What did you find about how the media was perceiving her during this time?
Well, the media became noticeably worse in the 1940s. At this time, the media was actually okay. They didn't know her very well. And even though she had been in jail in Hay, I don't think those records and that case came to be known in Sydney immediately. I think it would have taken a while. It was pre-digital age. So the media was actually quite sympathetic, actually. And the other thing about the way the media wrote about violence or criminal activities in those days was that the Sydney Morning Herald wouldn't really touch the stories. They would just report them in a very telegraphic way. They would have the court records, the cases of people going through the courts each day, but they wouldn't have big investigative articles. It was the tabloid media that reported on crime, and yeah, they would often blow it up into something quite lurid, and particularly if there was a bit of sexual scandal or particularly if there was a scarlet woman, they would really go to town on that.
So Iris is still in and out of prison. In 1939 alone, she serves 3 small sentences. And then in 1940, she's back in again behind bars for a year for mugging a man. What were the circumstances of that offence and Iris's involvement?
Now, that's actually a bit of a mystery, and the charges were both assault and robbery, and she was in jail for a very long time, and she wrote some really interesting letters from jail, like really beautiful copperplate, an incredible grasp of legalese, and she started to take over her own defences at this time. She was apparently studying court cases. There was a big pile of newspapers in her house. Actually, back from the time of the Maley crime, there was this big pile of newspapers, and she started to study how the system worked and she started to defend herself. And I don't really know what happened. So a guy reputedly was drinking with her in one of the wine bars around Surrey Hills, that part of Surrey Hills near Central Station. And then supposedly she took him into a back alley and said, "Give me your money, your mug." And she had some knuckle dusters and beat him and took his money. But she denied doing that.
What do we know about what Iris was like in prison? Was she a rule follower?
No, not always. I mean, you'd get put into solitary for things like insolence and, insulting language. And
I think I read something about her talking about being starving or?
Oh, yeah, she complained in court about how terrible the food was in prison and, nobody could survive on it. Yeah.
I'm getting the feeling that Iris was not one to back down. She had a strong personality.
Very, yeah, yeah.
In 1942, she's released again and she goes on to live in a new part of Sydney. She's in Woolloomooloo this time round, and she gets involved with selling sly grog. What's that?
Well, sly grog was a huge illicit trade in alcohol that went on in Sydney from 1916 till 1953, and it's incredible that we don't know more about it because prohibition in the US was nothing in comparison. This was such a long period. So there was a big riot out at the barracks in Liverpool in 1916 of soldiers. Some of them had already been to war and had come back and were going again. And they broke out of the barracks, and they basically went on a rampage from Liverpool all through the western suburbs into the city, into pubs, drinking, fighting, smashing things up. And there had already been a movement towards curtailing licensing laws, and a lot of Methodists actually were involved in that movement. And then, bang, they got restricted. And it has a lot of echoes, of course, with today, or what happened, with the lockout laws. So from that time, there was a really big illicit trade, and it was a really common thing for people to do because you could do it in a really little backyard way, just sell a little bit out your back window, or you could build an empire like Kate Lee that a lot of the listeners probably know about. You could run several groggeries and turn it into a really big trade.
So was Iris caught?
Yeah, she was, and she would have been one of the smaller traders. She never had much power or money. And again, significantly, for instance, one of the times that she was caught, it was a bottle of scotch to an American provost. There were lots of Americans during the war in Sydney. She got a 6-month sentence for sly grog, a good behaviour bond of 3 years and a fine of £100. And she's quoted as saying in court, "I intend to give up this means of livelihood because of loss of sleep. It means living on your nerves, more or less." Anyway, that was clearly a really inflated punishment for that crime.
Because £100, that's a lot by today's standards.
That is huge. The average weekly wage back then was £5 to £10 for a working man, for a blue-collar wage.
You're listening to True Crime Conversations with me, Gemma Barth. I'm speaking with author Fiona Kelly McGregor about Iris Webber, the most violent woman in Sydney in the 1930s. She's back in prison in 1943. I think I'm becoming a bit of a broken record. She's got a lot of these for assaulting another man. What do we know about that situation?
Oh, no, that's really interesting because that's a case that was recounted in the book that made her notorious. Was a book about this female policewoman called Lillian Armfield, and the book is called Rugged Angel, and there's an entire chapter on Iris, which is called the most violent woman in Sydney, and that's where that epithet comes from. And the way that that incident is recounted in the book is that this young man went to her just to try to get a drink and was just politely asking what the price was, and she nearly chopped off his hands with a tomahawk to the point where he lost use of his hands. But actually, once I did more research on this, what I found out was that this guy, Jackie Hodder, was actually a really violent young criminal, and he was going into her house to stand over her and get money. And she did have a go at him, and she did get him, but he was back on the streets committing lots of crime a few months later. So he didn't lose use of his hands. In fact, he beat a guy to death in Waterloo a few years later, and he went to prison for 10 years.
Wow.
Yeah.
What was her punishment for that crime?
Well, she went back into jail, and she had a criminal lawyer called Harold Munro act for her. Harold Munro, at exactly the same time, was involved in an entrapment scam with 2 police officers where they were entrapping men in public toilets in places like Hyde Park, Wynyard Station, and they were bribing them because if it was disclosed that they were found in a public toilet for what was called indecent exposure, the consequences would have been terrible. And so they had this big scam going, and they were getting as many as 200 to 300 men a year. Anyway, Harold Munro was this very interesting, rather bent criminal lawyer, and he was acting for Iris at that time. Something happened in that case. She wasn't happy and she sacked him, and so she took over her own defence.
Obviously, Iris has a lot of charges on her rap sheet by now. She has been in and out of prison a lot, but through reading her story, she was acquitted of a lot of charges over the years. And you talk about the fact that a lot of the time during this time in history, men didn't want to admit.
Yeah.
And that was a woman?
That was so common. I mean, all of the women that people might recognise the names, Tilly Devine, Kate Lee, Nellie Cameron, they all picked up a fist or a gun or a razor against men at some point. And the men never testified against them because it would have been considered humiliating for them to have actually been attacked by a woman. So that was quite consistent that happened to Iris as well.
Iris goes on to marry again, another man. What do we know about her husband and the circumstances of their marriage?
Look, he was just a petty crim, and he was 20 or 30 years older than her. What was his name? William Furlong. He was in his 60s when she married him. And I don't know much about him, actually. He just kind of came out of left field. And my surmisal is that she married him because she was really notoriously queer by then. She had her second female lover and they were living together. And I think that they met in prison, actually. And she was being absolutely hammered by the police. And I think that she married William Furlong to just try to attain heterosexual respectability for a while. I don't think it worked.
Because you mentioned that woman that she started dating, Vera. Tell me about their relationship.
Well, Vera May Sarawi is the person that she was living with in Woolloomooloo, and they actually ran that Sly Grog business together. And Vera was in Long Bay State Reformatory for Women, where they went to jail, which was the same jail that's there now, but it was just the old wing. It was actually originally built just for women. Anyway, I think that they probably met in jail in the early 1940s, and Vera's name, Sarawi, is actually a Malay name. She was married to a Malay sailor, and I'm not sure if she was actually living with him as well as with Iris, or why she married him or who he was. And Vera was a petty thief, a bit of a sex worker, a sort of hand-to-mouth existence, much like any of the other women. They were together until Iris died 10 years later.
While they were together in 1945, there's another murder surrounding Iris, Margaret Tibbetts.
Oh, yeah. Yep. It happened in Iris and Vera's house, and Margaret Tibbetts was a 43-year-old sex worker and thief, and they were all sitting around playing cards and having a sing-along. Iris's accordion playing is all through all of this. Anyway, Kathleen McLennan had a different name then. She changed her name to Millicent Tanga, and Tanga is also a Malay name. She was also married to a Malay sailor. Anyway, they were all sitting around having a sing-along, and there was some kind of argument between Margaret Tibbetts and Kathleen, and it got violent. It spilled out into the street. Margaret Tibbetts was shot in the groin and she bled to death in the street.
So it was not Iris involved directly, but it was in her house.
It was in her house, and she was actually initially arrested, I think. Now, those records are a little bit sketchy because the primary sources, when I was researching this, there's a 70-year embargo and I couldn't actually access all of them. But I'm going to go back and have a look.
We've only touched on a small handful of the charges and the prison stints that Iris was involved in. But by 1948, Iris is, in her 40s now, and she's given the label of one of the most violent women in Sydney, which you mentioned before. What's your take on that?
Well, that happened in a courtroom, and it was 1948, so we've got all of this history and notoriety that's built up. We've got the fact that has not hidden these relationships with women, which is absolutely shocking at the time. I suspect also that she probably was looking at that law and thinking, well, I'm not criminalised, so I will just defy you and I'm not going to hide this. So that's the reputation she's got. Now she goes into court and she pulled up her dress and she said to the judge and the prosecutor, look at the bruises on my leg. This is from a bashing that I got in cells. The police bashed me and Vera and they pulled out our hair. And the police prosecutor turned around and said, you're the most violent woman in Sydney. So there's a good context for how that came about. Yeah.
Iris died in 1953. She was only 47, which sounds young to us nowadays, but it was a different time. She died from carcinoma of the rectum and diabetes. What do we know about her final years? Was there much more violence?
She was in Macalone Street in Woolloomooloo for a few years with Vera, and they were just doing the same things as before, petty thieving, busking with her accordion. That's all that I can find, yeah.
I think it's worth pointing out that it was such a different era. You had to piece this together so meticulously from so many different sources. What drew you to writing about Iris in the first place?
I saw her in an exhibition on Gay and Lesbian Sydney 20 years ago at New South Wales Parliament House. And it was the photograph of her that we see on the book with that incredibly compelling gaze. And she was described in that lurid way as this 1920s gangster that shot a man over a rivalry for her mole. And I was, quite titillated by that and excited by that. And I also just sort of felt really penetrated by this gaze. And so I started to look into the story in between the books that I was writing at the time. And then I became more serious about the research about 5 or 10 years into it. And of course, I very quickly discovered that she wasn't a 1920s gangster. She was a 1930s, 40s, 50s petty criminal, that there really wasn't much power or glamour. In fact, there was a lot of poverty and persecution. But it made me want to tell the story even more because there's so much pathos there. And I think that in terms of queer history, this is what happened to us and we need to know. And it's hard to look at sometimes, but actually I came out of it with a huge amount of admiration for her, ultimately.
There's no doubting that she was a criminal. She hurt people. She broke the rules. But after reading about how she was portrayed at the time by the media and how that kind of just stuck in history until you kind of came along and started piecing it together, what are your reflections on her life and crimes?
Well, one of my questions was, what is a criminal? I mean, if, homosexuality is against the law, and also let's never forget, Indigenous people didn't even have citizenship until I was 2 years old.
Mm.
And so immediately you are a criminal just by being yourself. If you're queer or if you're not white, we had the White Australia policy until 1972. We had vagrancy laws, we had consorting laws. Some of those laws, the consorting laws, for instance, there's more vestiges of them around now than a lot of us realise. And so my question is, well, maybe you're a criminal by default if you're poor, if you're queer, if you're black. And also just in terms of opportunities for women, even regardless of class or milieu, there are far fewer opportunities. And also in terms of laws around sex work and attitudes towards sex work. I do describe it as a criminal milieu, but I don't use that term as a black and white term of it's not a judgment or a summary. It's really a social area. It's not a final say anyway.
What do you want listeners to take away from Iris's story?
Well, I really wanted to exhume this character that had been so damned, and I wanted to fill her out, give her humanity. And I wanted to understand her, and by understanding her, understand the period and the milieu. And I mean, I'm a Sydney-sider and I've walked those streets for so long. I feel enriched by knowing more about them, and I wanted to share that. And, there's a whole lot of things that I wanted to do as a novelist, which were about pushing the membrane of the medium and technical things and imaginative things and emotional things that I really wanted to use this material to attain.
To bring it to life, really.
Yeah, absolutely. Yep.
Thanks to Fiona for assisting us to tell this story. If you'd like to read her book, Iris, which is a dramatic retelling of Iris Weber's life and crimes through first-person narrative, you'll find a link for it in our show notes. True Crime Conversations is a Mamma Mia podcast hosted by me, Gemma Barth. The executive producer is Gia Moylan. If you've enjoyed this episode, let us know by leaving a rating or review in your favourite podcast app. It helps other true crime fans find our content and helps us keep making the episodes you get to enjoy every week. Thanks for listening. I'll be back next week with another True Crime Conversation.